I've talked a lot about growing our skills as miniature painters in our recent videos, as well as the value of pushing ourselves to tackle projects that challenge us. But I must admit that even having painted miniatures for as long as I have, I still come across models that intimidate me or take longer to figure out. Most recently, it has been the Super Fantasy Brawl range that has caused me to procrastinate. These are, after all, a very different scale and design to the miniatures you have seen me paint on the channel to date. To the uninitiated, the tiny scale of the miniatures we paint as part of our hobby often seems like the most difficult factor in making them look exceptional. As you develop your skills as a miniature painter, you come to realise that bigger is not necessarily easier, and that smaller models with a high density of sculpted detail can actually be a more forgiving prospect than larger flat volumes where any defect in your blend is going to be more apparent. Take Lorelei for example. Typical of Super Fantasy Brawl's style, the model features hair, tentacles, branches, that are essentially thick tubes that will require very delicate shading to convey lighting effectively, and that's before we even get onto the worm dragon thing that accompanies her into battle. Stick to the techniques of a 28mm hero here and you will end up with a very flat looking model. The challenges this creates have delayed our Super Fantasy Brawl content for far too long, so let's explore them together along with some of the techniques and the thought process I used to get Lorelei ready to stand out for the right reasons in the arena. A great way to get a head start on the subtle blends we need for Lorelei's voluminous hair tentacles is to use a zenithal prime to lay out transitions from light to dark before we add any colour. If you're not sure what zenithal priming is or how to do it, I really recommend checking out our 5 tools video, which talked about this technique as well as many other key terms and tools that we will be using in this video. In all the artwork for the game, Lorelei's eyes are glowing yellow orbs with no pupil, so I reinforced the brightness by painting both eyes with a slither of white paint, any brand you like, and then used Warcolor's one coat yellow over the top. You could use any bright yellow for this, I just happened to have this one to hand. For fun, I played around with adding some yellow fluorescent paint into the mix to see if this would make the yellow brighter, and also added in some white towards the centre of the eye to make it look less flat. These were experiments and it's debatable if they had any real effect on the final result. Once done, I covered everything on the model I considered Lorelei's skin with a base coat of scale colour Sherwood Green. During my video on becoming intimate with your paint collection, I talked about the lower opacity of many scale colour paints compared to my usual Vallejo brand. This makes them a perfect choice, as the base coat will not completely cover the shading and highlights from the primer. For future steps, we'll have a much better idea where the shadows and highlights should be, making it easier to achieve a realistic blend. And having a base coat will ensure that anywhere our blend is a little thin, it still comes through as a saturated green colour. The vivid colours in this range also give me the best possible start in creating a model that is more vibrant than the earthy mythological models we've painted to date. For the shadows, I'm mixing in some German field grey from Vallejo's model colour range to the Sherwood Green of the base coat. I'm switching brands here because I want to reach opacity in the shadow areas quite quickly so I can focus on the more interesting highlights, and I know this paint will help me with that. I applied this shadowed colour anywhere the darker parts of the undercoat were still coming through, and used pure Sherwood Green to blend the edges of these areas with the areas we will highlight presently. We've talked about wet blending a few times on the channel, but if you're joining us for the first time, it describes the technique of blending paints once they are on the model, allowing you to refine your blends quickly in situ as opposed to layering colours onto the model over several coats. When you have large volumes like Lorelei's hair, layering can be difficult to achieve without leaving visible lines between the different coats. Once complete, I wanted to make the darkest recesses between the branches of her hair even darker, and tried using green tone wash from Army Painter to achieve this. I also used a slightly thinned version of this wash around the bottom edges of the thorns to give them greater contrast with the rest of the hair. Once complete, I did have some corrections to make where the wash left an edge line, but it was a quick and easy way to get a really dark shade into these thin areas and really pick out different parts of the hair. Once this had completely dried, I started to add Fall Green, another light and semi-translucent paint from Scale Colour, to the Sherwood Green to create our highlight coats, and slowly worked up over several coats of highlight blending this into the base tone in exactly the same way as the shadow tones. On average, I made her face slightly brighter than most other parts of the model to try to draw attention to this key aspect. I likewise highlighted the thorns so that they would stand out from the hair without having to be a completely different tone. Having all our different tones still active on the wet palette means that you can revert back to any previous shade you need to if you overstep or find that your transitions are too stark. It's worth being patient here, as the skin is a focal point of the model overall, and by design everything else we paint will be intended to complement these areas rather than overwhelm them. If you feel the blend is going wrong, it might be better to let the whole thing dry and come back than to risk lifting semi-dried paint from the model. If you keep your paints thin, you will be able to correct any missteps. In a game of Super Fantasy Brawl, Lorelei has a surprisingly high armour rating that lets her shrug off all but the most powerful attacks despite her relatively modest health statistics. For this reason, I wanted her armour to be interesting without overwhelming her facial features. I interpreted Lorelei's armour as being made out of leaves and decided to go for an autumn tone, which would contrast with her skin in a bright and interesting way, whilst also being in keeping with her background as a dryad keeping the world in its natural balance. To start with, I applied a base coat of Hull Red from Vallejo Model Colour, which I thinned down so that once again the light and dark of the primer would still be partially visible. Once this has had time to dry, I mixed highlight tones by adding Vallejo Game Colour Orange Fire to my base coat and applied this everywhere except the recesses. I tried to leave a darker line in the centre of each piece of mail on her armour to reinforce the fact that her outfit is made of leaves. I was slightly more generous with the highlights on the front of Lorelei than on the back, where her armour is largely in shadow. Painting the armour may feel fiddly given the individual leaf sculpted, but by angling your brush carefully you can avoid having to paint each leaf while still maintaining more control over your highlights than would be possible using a rougher technique such as dry brushing. In any case, the armour was one of the most enjoyable elements to paint during this entire process. After I'd completed this first highlight, I added more orange fire to create a slightly brighter highlight and applied this to the edges and tips of the leaves to make these stand out. I focused this highlight on areas that would either catch the light, or areas where I wanted to create the impression the armour was more exposed to the light, creating a pleasing gradient of tones on the front of her armour without having to do any blending at all. To pump up the contrast, I turned to our old friend Black Leather from Scale Colour and added quite a lot of water to create a really thin shadow wash that I could then add to the recesses of the armour. This was applied more liberally where the armour was in shadow, but equally used to pick out the individual leaves by increasing the distance between the shadow tones and the brightest highlights. If you're not sure how much to thin your paints here, it's worth pointing out that if you over-thin them, you can always use multiple coats to build this effect over time. It is not so easy to remove the shade if you fail to thin it sufficiently. We're going to move on to what I'm choosing to call her Forest Spirit Companion, as it will be easier to paint the roots once both models are otherwise painted. I didn't want the Forest Spirit to detract from Lorelei herself too much, which is a big risk given that it is bigger than the Dryad by some volume. So I decided to go with a darker but still interesting green tone, selecting Scale Colour Boreal Green as my base coat. No, seriously, it's green. I don't know what's going on with the footage here. In real life, to my eyes, this is a nice dark green colour, but it shows up very blue on our cameras. Maybe there's a fluorescent element to the pigments, or the camera is reacting to the contrast with her more yellow skin? Ideas in the comments, please. This issue does make some of my shading appear quite clumsy on camera, but as the techniques used are the same as on Lorelei, and the final reveal photos are much closer to reality, you should get the idea. Being one long tubular creature, our approach to the Forest Spirit matches that for Lorelei's hair, but with the blends being even more crucial to the final result. On the areas in light, I added Game Colour Jade Green to the Boreal Green and started localised wet blending. In areas that were in shadow, I added a little of the black leather already on my palette to the boreal green to darken it further and use the same technique but going from dark to light instead of from light to dark. Another useful technique whilst doing this is feathering, which is where you apply a wet brush to the edges of a layer still wet on the model. This dilutes the paint at the edge, creating a blend effect with the base layer without actually blending two paints. I used a mixture of these techniques for the highlight and shading of the spirit. It's also worth mentioning that the roots wrapped around the forest spirit divide his body into sections, meaning we can work on small areas of the body without worrying too much about the blends failing to align perfectly with those in neighbouring areas. Once this was complete, I added some of the full green we used on Lorelei to the jade green and applied further highlights to the most well lit areas of the forest spirit's back. And also the ridges on its head, which really benefit from some extra attention. I was really enjoying how this was turning out, not that the camera is giving me any help showing you this, so I pushed the highlights on the head even further by adding brighter highlights to the edges and tips of the head ridges. To my eyes, this was already creating a sort of phosphorescent effect, so I decided to play around a bit to see if I could actually make the eyes glow. I applied pure white to the eyes themselves and used a thin white on the ridges closest to the eyes to set up a subdued glow. I then mixed the watercolours One Coat Yellow and Vallejo Yellow fluorescent colours I used on Lorelei's eyes earlier, and applied this to the eyes and over the ridges that I had applied the thin white coat to earlier. This is definitely an effect that could be taken further, but for a quick 2 minutes of effort I wasn't too disappointed with the result, even if, as with everything on the Forest Spirit, this doesn't show up well on camera. Finally happy with both Lorelei and her spirit companion, I turned my attention to the last major feature of the model we have yet to paint, which I've interpreted as coiling roots. With hindsight, it might have made more sense for me to paint these areas as green vines rather than roots, as they clearly have flowers growing from them. But when planning the model I was already concerned about the different elements of the model blending together in a green smudge, and wanted the contrast of a wood tone. To begin, I added some more black leather to my palette and thinned it down just slightly to a normal base coat consistency so it would move smoothly from my brush. I then base coated all of the root areas with at least one coat. I went in with the shadow green tones anywhere I accidentally overstepped the root, which was quick and easy with the tones still on my wet palette. Once complete, I mixed some scale colour sandalwood into this base tone to create a pinkish grey-brown colour and added this to the most raised areas of the roots. In the case of some of the larger roots, I would go back and feather this back into the base tone, whilst the most upturned area got a brighter highlight on top by adding more sandalwood, but overall this was a fairly rough and quick step, just to create some contrast. It is worth taking your time to ensure that you preserve the skin colours you have already applied. The cleaner these roots are painted, the more impressive the final result will look. Then I moved on to the flowers, which had a brilliant dash of contrasting colour to this very green-brown model. I started by applying an initial coat of model colour purple to all of the flowers. If you wanted, you could paint the flowers white or beige first, which will likely make them brighter on the finished result, but I wanted to leave the flowers that are in shadow with a slightly darker tone, so I decided not to do so. Once complete, I started to mix model colour Old Rose into the purple to create successive highlight coats, which were applied to the edges of the petals, covering a little less of the flower with each successive highlight to create a nice transition from light to dark. Finally, once these initial colours had dried, I took Game Colour Royal Purple and really thinned it down to a wash consistency. I then fed this into the centre of the flowers so that it sank into the recesses, and also used it to outline the flowers anywhere I felt this was necessary. This increased the overall contrast of dark to light on the flowers and helped them to pop against an already vibrant model. I could have painted the pistil a contrasting colour, maybe a vibrant orange or yellow. Sometimes you have to know when to leave a model alone, and for me I had reached that point. This video is already too long, so I completed the base off camera, but let me know in the comments if you want me to show you in a future video, as I intend to have some consistency with the bases of our various Super Fantasy Brawl models. Once done, I painted the edge of the base black, and Lorelei was complete. Lorelei is finally ready to face the other brawlers of Fabulosa. This character and sculpt were probably the one I was most looking forward to receiving from the original Super Fantasy Brawl Kickstarter. And to echo the sentiments of my painting resolutions video, sometimes it is better to paint the model you're excited about than a model you have perfectly planned out. In this case, my desire to paint this beautiful model pushed me through uncertainties and missteps in the process, and now I have a much clearer idea of the techniques I will use on other models in the range. This is not to say that I think she is perfect. In fact, I hope to one day have the opportunity to paint her again and make different, bolder choices than I did this time around. Maybe I'll try a more vibrant and intricate design for the flowers, or paint the forest spirit in a bold white colour as if he is a winter spirit of some kind. That's the nice thing about painting miniatures. We get to decide what's finished and what's still work in progress, and whether we return to the same sculpts in future or try something different. I hope that this video was inspirational to you, whether you plan to paint this model yourself or, like me, are taking your first tentative steps into this range of models. If you do attempt this model either with your own ideas or attempting to follow this video as a guide, I would absolutely love to see the results, whether you are experienced at painting or not. You can contact me via the comments on this YouTube video or find me as victor.seraph on Instagram. Do let us know in the comments which Super Fantasy Brawl model you would like to see me attempt next, no promises mind you, and help the channel to grow by sharing this video with anyone you think would enjoy it. We'll be back soon, but until then, work hard, play better, and take care out there.